very grateful you could all be here. And I'd like to introduce you now to our guest. He is one of America's most articulate, influential, and humorous speakers on waste management. See, you're laughing already. In fact, Ralph Nader said, he's the only person I know who can make waste interesting. And he's been doing it for years. Our guest says that we're living on this planet as if we had another planet to go to. You cannot run a throwaway society on a finite planet. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you one of America's leading experts on waste management, Dr. Paul Connett.
On our last Healing the Earth show, Dr. Connett discussed low-tech solutions to the trash crisis. Today, he reviews the 10 steps for developing a sustainable society.
Thank you. One of the things which comes out of this is not only waste reduction in terms of quantity, but toxics reduction. As we discover the problems of mercury, what are you going to do with the mercury in batteries? There is a comparable drive to clean production. Not just make less waste, but stop using as many toxics. If we can't handle the toxics at the back end, then you shouldn't be using these toxics at the front end. So along with the trash crisis, I'm now moving to the hazardous waste crisis and saying that the thing that we've got to drive now is for clean production in hazardous waste. In 1986, the OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment, which is an arm of US Congress, said that we could reduce hazardous waste in this country by a massive 50% in 5 years with off-the-shelf technology. Did we do it? No, we didn't. Why? Because we have our regulators fixated at the back end with hazardous waste too. They spend all their time trying to cite hazardous waste landfills and hazardous waste incinerators rather than getting companies to organize at the front end, rather than put the creativity at the front end. But the good news is that where companies like 3M Corporation have attempted this is the chief executive officer of 3M Corporation saying that in 10 years, they had 1,900 projects to cut back on waste production, and they saved the company $292 million. You're going to hear a lot more of these things. This is the big news, that the front-end consultants, if they can get the creativity at the front end, and if they can get the cooperation of management and the workers, if you can get their cooperation, particularly the workers, because they know where the waste is. They know where the waste is being produced in these companies. Then you can really, I've said it already, you can save money whilst you're protecting the environment. It's a win-win situation. It's only inertia which has kept us back, and the preoccupation of these boring people who think with the wrong ends of their bodies, who've been trying to push the back end. And let's have a look at those people. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the regulatory industrial complex. This is the unholy triangle between the regulatory agency, the industry, and consultants. And they, of course, they move from place to place. So you can't tell the difference. You go to a conference, they all wear suits, they all wear blue suits and stuff, and you can't tell. One day they're working for the industry, the next day they're working for government, and the next day they're being consultants. And what does this do? It denies common sense. It treats the public as the enemy. It designs solutions for other people to live with. None of these people will ever earn a salary too low that they'll ever have to live with one of these things. They're always doing it for other people. Poor people, powerless people, weak people, black people, Indian reservations, third world countries, but never them. It's much easier to design solutions for other people than for yourself. It corrupts science. Yes, they corrupt science. They play with science with a double-headed coin. You know that? If science serves their purpose, science is king. But if science does not serve their purpose, policy is king. We switch from one to the other. Remember that when they're telling you as citizens that you're emotional, you're not scientific. I want to tell you that the science underpinning hazardous waste disposal in this country is very bad science. There's very bad science going on with incineration, particularly hazardous waste incineration. Very bad science. It's a lousy experiment. It's been very badly designed. More about that in a moment. It confuses public hearings with democracy. We've already said that. They have the power to permit, which is awesome, but not the power to protect. You need, sometimes somebody say, well, with these strong regulations, we'll protect you. Look at the regulations. The only way the regulations will protect you from a hazardous waste incinerator is if you convert them into a face mask. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. You need three things to protect you, to protect the environment and your health. You need strong regulations, you need adequate monitoring, and you need aggressive enforcement. And if the monitoring is inadequate and the enforcement is unaggressive, you are not protected. And that's exactly the case with hazardous waste incinerators. They have no idea what toxic metals are coming out of the stack of an incinerator at any time. They give them a month's notice before they measure what's coming out. And they have no idea at any moment what dioxins and furans are coming out. There is no instrumentation that can tell you what is coming out of the stack of an incinerator. Instead, they do a test burn on some prearranged time, and then you are meant to assume that that's what's going to tell you for the rest of the time. It's a joke. It's a sick joke played on the public, which is getting sicker. And as far as enforcement is concerned, I have pussycats at home that are more aggressive. And what happens is, you're a community, and you think after this incinerator was built that these respiratory problems that you're having to shut your windows at night, seeing the black smoke, and your fear about these other problems in the community, cancer rates and so on, you think it's caused by this incinerator. And you go to the regulatory agency and ring them up and say, this incinerator's doing this, that, and the other. And they say, that's not scientific. That's anecdotal. And so you get these poor, probably poor people, because that's where they build them, are expected to prove scientifically that their cancer rate or whatever sickness that they're having is caused by this machine. And I think we've got to have the courage to tell governments that that ain't right. That's not right. In other words, what I suggest is this. If a community suspects that that facility is causing them a health problem, and they can make a plausible case, just a plausible case, that that's the source of the problem, because it didn't exist, say, before it went online, there don't seem to be other obvious sources, then the onus of proof should go back to the government that permitted this facility. They should now have the onus of proof to show that that facility has not caused that damage, and if they can't do that, they should remove the permit. That's as simple as that. Now, the EPA, in epistle after epistle after epistle to the public, has this wonderful quote, and it comes like just from Genesis. A well-designed, well-maintained and well-operated hazardous waste incinerator poses no human health or environmental threat, end of quote. Let me read it to you again. A well-designed, well-maintained and well-operated hazardous waste incinerator poses no human health or environmental threat. What does that translate to? There it is on the screen. It translates to this. We don't know what to do with this stuff. Incineration is better than dumping it into a hole in the ground. By the time the problems are identified, I will be retired. That's what they're saying. You see, if you put the stuff into a hole in the ground, all the evidence is there. The containers are there, the names of who produced it, and so on. And it's, for the official's point of view, it's always a liability. But if you burn it and have the illusion of destroying the stuff, even though you've scattered it to the winds, and goodness knows where the ash goes to, then it's going to take a long time for anybody to really nail down those problems. Well, as I said, there are 18 or 19 hazardous waste incinerators, commercial hazardous waste incinerators in this country. And then you've got many more cement kilns that want to burn it, including Montana. You've got Lafarge, Holman's and others. You should do your best to support any in your own states, or if you come from this area, do your best to get a classification of that cement. Have a little symbol on it. This cement, this concrete, was made using hazardous waste. That would slow that down. But anyway, I had the opportunity to confront one of these EPA officials. They do occasionally come out. The head of Region 5, Val Adamkis. came out and talked to the Sierra Club. He thought that was safe. And he didn't know I was in the audience. As soon as he finished his presentation, I put my hand up. I said, Mr. Adamkis, it's the EPA's position a well-designed, well-maintained, and well-operated hazardous waste incinerator poses no human health or environmental threat. I said, there are 17, at that time there were 17 commercial hazardous waste incinerators operating in this country. Could you please tell me one that meets this description? It was almost as if I'd slapped him in the face. He staggered back and said, well, I'm not here to promote incineration. But it basically, what else can he do? That's what it is. But he never, ever was able to say which of these things was safe. Now, I thought he was going to volunteer a couple, but he didn't. And then later on, I told the citizens in East Liverpool, Ohio, who were fighting one of these things, I said, you know, ask every EPA official that's telling you that these things are safe, ask them where there's a safe one. So they did this. And Bill Muno, also I believe of Region 5, when they challenged him, he said, oh, Chicago. With which the citizens nearly fell off their seats, because they knew that the hazardous waste incinerator in Chicago had blown up about a year before. It had blown up. It had blown up. And that it had been fined, the company had been fined $3.5 million for various violations like disconnecting the air pollution control equipment and relabeling the containers. And this guy gave it as an example of it's a farce. It's a farce. Where now the studies are beginning to come in, where scientists have gone in and they are finding more health problems downwind of these facilities than upwind of these facilities. Science News, let me give you the date on this because you really want to read this. Science News, May the 22nd, 1993, has a summary of the health problems near hazardous waste incinerators. And so it's now finally coming on. It isn't just those anecdotal citizens out there. But now I'd like to show you what absolutely the most grotesque thing that's going on right now in this country as far as the environment is concerned. And I refer to East Liverpool, Ohio. You know, the United States is a very large country, and there are many places that you could possibly build an incinerator. For me, there are none. But this has to be the worst. What will be, when they put the second one on the same site, will be one of the world's largest commercial hazardous waste treatment centers and incinerators. And it is on the banks of the Ohio River, which provides drinking water for 31 million people. It's on a 100-year floodplain. It's also on an aquifer, which would be an alternative drinking water supply. It's in a valley which has inversions 69% of the year. There are inversions there. And we have people living in housing above the height of the facility on the banks of this valley. We have housing which is 300 feet away from this facility, and we have an elementary school which is 1,100 feet away from this facility. And the school is on a bluff above the facility, such the height of the stack is level with the front door of the elementary school. Now, in 1985, the Ohio State Legislature, in their wisdom, decreed a 2,000-foot safety margin, a buffer zone, from housing, hospitals, and schools. That's what they put into law. But believe it or not, this facility was grandfathered because they got their permit in 1983. How on earth can you establish an unacceptable threat to children and people and then grandfather that threat? You may be able to do that in bureaucracies, but you can't do that if you're human beings, if you're anything other than boring people. And it's disgusting that this facility was not, they didn't even start to build this until 1990, 5 years after that law was on the books, 2,000 feet. Now, if you know the track record of hazardous waste incineration, as I know the track record, you know that that's a catastrophe waiting to happen. It's not a question of just what comes out of the stack. It's a question that the track record says it's only a matter of time before you have a truck accident, a train accident, a fire, an explosion, or a spill. And any one of those things could send poisonous gases straight into that school and straight into that housing. It's the height of engineering arrogance to build that facility, because what that says is that our engineering is so wonderful, so perfect, that we need no fail-safe. There is no fail-safe in that site. Now, is this marvelous technology? Number one, they failed their test burn. They didn't shut it down, though. Number two, they've emitted about 5 times more dioxin than the current EPA standard. And that was the editorial that was in the Wall Street Journal today about nanogram mafia, because we're concerned about that they're 5 times over the dioxin limit. And also, the facility is closed down because after 2 months of operating, they're having to replace the linings of the furnace. Does this sound like a perfect facility that needs no fail-safe? Is this an accident waiting to happen? Of course it is. Now, to add to that, I'm going to the regulatory industrial complex here. This company is registered 48 different ways. There are 48 different companies that have some claim or some connection to the ownership. There's a list of these companies here. And for those of us who are a little cynical, it seems to us that what's happening here is this company wants to make the maximum profit from this operation, but wants the minimum of liability. Because if anything goes wrong, which of those 48 companies are you going to go for? Now look at the names. Von Roll AG, Von Roll America Inc., Von Roll America, comma, Inc., Von Roll parenthesis America, comma, Inc., Von Roll Inc., Von Roll, comma, Inc., Von Roll Limited, Von Roll Limited, comma, Limited, Von Roll Ohio, Von Roll in parenthesis Ohio, comma, Inc., Von Roll Ohio, no comma, Inc., Von Roll Transport Systems, Inc. These are all different companies registered at different times, different places, with different people. Does that tell you that it is an honest company? Now, when Clinton and Gore were campaigning for office, they went to this valley and said there should be an inquiry. No facility should be sited so close to the river, etc., etc., etc. The first environmental act of the Clinton-Gore administration before they were in office was to make a statement that when they got into office, the first thing that they would do is to deny WTI an operating permit until there'd been a full investigation, both of the environmental dangers and this whole business of ownership and the permitting process. Another broken promise, folks. They gave that permit to that company. It is now, as I've told you, it is operating, and they're getting every sweetheart deal that comes along. And is it any wonder that people like myself don't have very kind words to say about these regulatory agencies? I'd like to put some of these people behind bars, quite frankly. Now, at the height of the battle, the EPA sent a high-ranking official. They couldn't send the head of the EPA. I mean, after all, it is a long journey from Washington, D.C. to Pittsburgh, and he had so many things to do that he himself couldn't go and have a look at this site himself. I mean, that's not very, let's be reasonable. The guy's a busy man. So they sent a high-ranking official named Lou Crampton. And Lou, we have this handwritten memo from Lou Crampton when he saw this site. And he said, certainly, and reading the handwriting here, you can't read it, but I know what it says. It says, certainly is one of the worst land use situations I have seen. The citizens were thrilled to have an EPA official come into their community and recognize that this was an absolutely atrocious place to do this. Well, I'm sad to tell you that Lou Crampton, a few weeks after making that statement, left the EPA and is now working for Waste Management Incorporated, which is the company which many of us believe is behind most of this operation. So he's now working for the other side. Even at the time when he was collecting this information, he was supposed to be representing the citizens. Which brings me to the 2 laws of waste management. First law is the bad law. The level of pollution increases as the level of corruption increases. The more corrupt your county, your state, your country, the more polluted your state, county, or country will be. Someone will go and prove that law once, sooner or later. I've guessed it, but it seems to be falling quite nicely with my experience. That's the bad law. The good law is, and whether in Estonia, the former Soviet Union, or Switzerland or Germany, it's the same thing. the level of pollution decreases as the level of public participation increases. To protect the environment, if you don't believe me, go to the former Soviet Union, as I've done, and see what it's like to have an environment that's not protected by the people. Getting upset. If the people are not there, getting angry, getting emotional, and threatening the politicians that if they don't do something about this, they're going to be voted out of office, then the environment is not protected. It's not protected by our laws. It's not protected by these bureaucrats. It's only protected by people when they organize, when they network, and when they put the pressure on. And that's that second law. And you can put that another way. You can put that another way. Polite people get poisoned. Now, when you do organize, industry is all ready for you. They got a word for you. If you organize and say, we don't want this utterly atrocious, abominable, backward, sloppy, unimaginative, lacking in vision project in our community, they will say, you're just a bunch of NIMBYs. Which says, there's nothing wrong with our project, there must be something wrong with you. NIMBY is industry's word for democracy, especially when it is effective, when we organize politically and put the heat on the politicians to take responsibility for the decisions and not put them off to these faceless bureaucrats, then it's effective. And NIMBY, they would like to portray NIMBYism, this backyard, protecting your backyard, as against progress. After all, you want the VCRs, don't you, madam? Or after all, you use a dry cleaner, don't you? Or after all, you want a car and they're dirty and polluting. Therefore, you should have this facility. You should be one of those lucky 18 communities in the United States that have all the hazardous waste dumped on you and have it burnt in the state-of-the-art technology fitted with best available control technologies which couldn't harm anything. You're being very unreasonable. You're blocking progress. And I have to tell you, and I think this is accurate, NIMBYs are not blocking progress. What they're doing is forcing the solutions from the back end to the front end. Eventually these bureaucrats will realize, as they are realizing, that they can't site these landfills, and they can't site these incinerators, and they can't get away with these back end solutions, and the only alternative is to start going to the front end solution. Now, in this EPA thing, still on this regulatory industrial complex, during one of the court cases there, this memo came out of the EPA. It was smuggled out and was given to Greenpeace. It was by Rich Guymond, I think it was the deputy administrator of the EPA. And he sent this memo to Carol Bronner, who just came in. This is January the 22nd, just after inauguration. He says, a preliminary assessment done by Office of Research and Development of the EPA does show that risks from beef and milk consumption can be 1,000 times higher than risks from inhalation near the WTI facility. Now, at that point, they'd done a risk assessment. The EPA had got a risk assessment done by a tame firm of consultants who knew exactly what was required and showed that the inhalation risks for dioxin living near the plant were acceptable. What they didn't do was what they should have done, which was to calculate the risks through the food chains. And when Greenpeace pointed out that the risk could be 10,000 times higher, they did their own calculations and they came back and said, no, it's 1,000 times higher. That meant the public had been told it was 1 in a million, but it was actually 1,000 in a million. And wouldn't you feel at that point the public should have been re-informed about what the real risks were? No. This memo was kept secret. If we hadn't had it smuggled out, we wouldn't have known about it. But notice what happens in a paragraph later. The analysis of the WTI situation shows that many air emission sources could be affected if EPA were to adopt the indirect exposure analysis procedure in assessing exposure risk. In other words, if we go from just assessing the risk through inhalation of pollutants like dioxins, and we move to doing a complete risk assessment, which takes in the contamination of food, of beef, of milk, of fish, it would jeopardize other projects that we're trying to permit. Isn't that a clear example of what I said earlier? If science wins, science is king, but if science loses, policy is the king? Isn't that a switch from science to policy? Isn't it good science at the top and bad science at the bottom? And that's what I find totally unacceptable. But that's what we're allowing to happen right now. I think the big message is this. more and more of us have to have the confidence that if you make the best environmental decision, it will turn out to be the best economic decision. We've got to cut away this rift between the two, that it's bad for the environment, but it's good for jobs. That doesn't work. The worst thing that we could do for jobs in this country is to protect dirty industries. It's the single worst thing. Because Sweden won't do that, and Germany won't do that, and Japan won't do that. They'll develop the clean industries and leave our industries standing if we insist upon perpetuating dirty industries. But I'd like to tackle this in a more philosophical way. It seems to me, if you give it enough time, there is no difference between ecology and economics. If you give it enough time. They have the same root. It's the welfare of our home. Ecology and economics converge if you give it enough time. And ecology and economics converge if you give it enough space. In other words, I'm going to suggest to you there is no difference between global economics and global ecology. It's the same subject. Global economics and global ecology is the same subject. But the tragedy for our society, I believe, is that whilst many scientists have worked out that global economics and global ecology is the same thing, our economists have not, by and large. We still have today Nobel Prize winning economists who rationalize a violation of what I would have thought would be Economics 101, and that's living off capital instead of income. Most of what's going on right now is a gigantic rationalization for living off capital instead of income. We are postponing the dreadful day of cutting back on the use of fossil fuels. And look at this childlike response of the great United States to a 4-cent increase on gasoline. My goodness gracious me, how pathetic, how puerile, how absolutely childlike on this planet to complain about a 4-cent gasoline tax, $4 gasoline tax maybe. They pay 3 times as much for gasoline in Germany, 3 times as much in England. Now it might have been justified when it was our oil that we were using to make this gasoline, and we said, oh, it's our oil and therefore it's cheap, and therefore we're going to give it to you cheaper than everybody else on the planet can use this oil. But we're importing the oil from the Middle East, building up a gigantic deficit that future generations are going to pay. So not only are we using up their oil, but they're paying for it. It's incredible. And that's what I mean by pathetic economists. I'm not an economist, but at least I can work out that we've got to find a way of living off income if we've got any chance of getting a sustainable society. And yes, indeed, we need a massive energy tax and use that energy tax to fund the alternative energy sources that our children and our grandchildren are going to need. That's where that money should go. So you can kill 2 birds with one stone.
You're watching Healing the Earth, presented by Elisabeth Clare Prophet, world-renowned author and founder of Summit University. Summit University is located at the beautiful Royal Teton Ranch in Park County, Montana, just north of Yellowstone National Park. For more information, call 1-800-245-5445. That's 1-800-245-5445.
It's lovely to be here. You know, sometimes you don't sound like us. I was in Spain, and they said, the company doctor, they were trying to build a hazardous waste incinerator in this Almaden, beautiful part of Spain. It's rather like this in some respects, with eagles and things flying all over the place. And they wanted to build a commercial hazardous waste incinerator because the mercury mine wasn't doing too well, and I had a debate. And the company doctor who told these people that mercury was completely harmless for human beings, and they had nothing to worry about, he said to me afterwards, he said, "You sound more like a priest than a scientist." So I said, "That's right, my son. God recycles, the devil burns." Well, I don't know if it was due to that, but that project has been cancelled. But I would like to run through 10 steps which I think are necessary to reach this sustainable society, and they kind of summarize some of the things I've said tonight. One is we need to shift the focus from back-end solutions to front-end solutions. I think I've said that a few times. Secondly, we have to shift the focus from short-term economic plans to long-term ecological plans. Next, we need to shift the focus from the standard of living to the quality of life. Yes, we could consume half as much and be twice as happy. We don't need to be told what to consume. We need to be told how to enjoy other people. See, the basic fabric of life is what we share with other people. We seem to have lost that as we've been fragmented into these little rooms, in little buildings, in big cities. What keeps us in those little rooms are those television sets which give us the second-hand life that I referred to earlier on. And that is not a good life. And if we were out of those rooms and dealing with other people, we could be consuming far less and enjoying life many, many, many more times over. We need to shift the focus from being clever and being wise, even if it's just a question of somebody asking, well, what is the difference? What do you mean by the difference between being clever and wise? Even if it's the first question we ask our students at university, the first lesson, what's the difference between clever and wise? Get them to think about it. What's the difference? Is there a difference? Next, we need to shift from arrogant technologies to elegant solutions which are modeled after nature's methods. And I consider genetic engineering the height of technical and scientific arrogance. I find it absolutely amazing that we cannot learn our lessons. We weren't able to control DDT or PCBs. We now know that there's a correlation between breast cancer and women, which has gone up from 1 in 16 in 1946 to 1 in 8 in the 90s. We now find a correlation between the levels of DDT in women and breast cancer. There seems to be a relationship there, and Greenpeace has pointed out correlations possibly with other chlorinated organics. If we couldn't control the little manipulations we did with chemicals, how on earth are we going to control the manipulations with genes? We are literally so small. And I say this as a professional chemist, and I say it with embarrassment, because I didn't always recognize this, that our understanding of chemistry is pathetically miserable compared to the manipulations of nature on this planet. We've got one tiny grain of sand on a great beach in terms of understanding. And yet, just because we can crack the DNA code and we have the clever ability to move these genes around and take a gene from a radish and put it into a mouse or vice versa, doesn't mean that we should do it. And that's where we come in. We have to get angry about that. I think nuclear power is arrogant. The same thing applies to break the atom apart and think that we could contain all the problems there. If breaking the atom was good for life on this planet, then nature would have broken the atom and done it. And to jump over to the end of the dioxin story, if we're going to get rid of dioxin, we're going to have to get rid of chlorine. It amazes me, again, about the ability to not ask the right question. It amazes me, and I'm trying to go through the literature to see if I can see any place where scientists could have reasonably asked this question. Before we introduce masses of chlorinated compounds, chlorinated substances, that's carbon joined to chlorine, into the environment, we should ask the question of why it is that nature did not introduce the carbon-chlorine bond into the mainstream of biochemistry. Why did she hold back? She can do it. We know she can do it. But why are there no carbon-chlorine bonds in any protein, fat, nucleic acid, or any other metabolite in human beings and in any terrestrial mammal? Yes, they make it in seaweeds. But why? Now, we glibly put 40 million tons, we take 40 million tons of chloride, which is benign, salt, and convert it to chlorine, which is a reactive gas, produce these chlorinated compounds, and nearly all of them have come back to haunt us. DDT, PCBs, chlordane, lindane, CFCs, ripping the ozone layer apart. Nature has no mechanisms, by and large, of handling this bond, but we were arrogant enough to put it out there before we asked that question. And I had the opportunity to read a treatise on chlorine, that thick, put out by the American Chemical Society, in which there is no reference to this whatsoever. Just a few paragraphs, little paragraphs on toxicity for mammals in a few places, but no big question. The date of that book was 1962. Do you know what date that was? That was the date of Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring. So the American Chemical Society and all its experts were unable to ask the questions that this wonderful woman was able to ask in that book. And they were oblivious of all the, and she published the book in '62, so they were oblivious of all the stuff that had led up to that book, which was out there in the literature. Amazes me. We need to rediscover, recreate, revitalize small communities, small businesses, small farms. The best book ever written on the environment was written by an economist, Small is Beautiful, by E.F. Schumacher. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's still the best book out there. It turns economics upside down. Basically, human beings are best in small communities. That doesn't mean that we don't realize the larger planet. We network those smaller communities. We interact with those small communities. We need to create a super fund for workers displaced from dirty industries. There are dirty industries out there which need closing down, but we don't need to make those workers the next set of toxic victims. We need to put a surcharge now on the toxic chemicals that we want to phase out, the CFCs, etc., and make sure that that money is earmarked for a massive retraining system like the GI Bill after World War II, which is one of the most successful economic plans for the United States that ever was. They took 17 million people out of the war industry and put them into the peace economy, and they put it largely by putting those into universities. And that's what we need to do with these workers. At the moment, when they become redundant, they're lucky if they get minimum wage. And that's not acceptable. And if we don't do that, we will drive these workers into the hands of the extreme right. And you can see that happening with the logging industry right now. The extreme right is right there to portray environmentalists as the next communist wave in this country, etc., etc., etc. You know it. You know it's going to happen. We need to protect the habitats of endangered species, and I include in those endangered species indigenous peoples. The peoples that we need precisely because for thousands of years they have lived with nature in harmony. They are what we call primitive. And I think it's quite clear that if those people that go in and look at these cultures and see their fantastic understanding of nature, whether you're talking about Eskimos or whether you're talking about Aborigines or whether you're talking about Indians in the jungles or whether you're talking about Native Hawaiians. The Native Hawaiians had a system of identifying biological systems, which is essentially the Linnaean system, but they had it hundreds of years before Linnaeus. These people have developed treatments for cancer and all kinds of things out there. I mean, we have the pharmaceutical industry falling over themselves trying to analyze what's in these herbs and things that they use out there. And yet we think they're primitive. They've outstripped the pharmaceutical industry, and yet we think they're primitive. This is an incredible resource that we should treat with a great more humility and make sure that they don't get crucified by greed. We need to network groups worldwide that are working for social justice and environmental justice, the same thing. We won't protect the environment unless we protect people. The two things are wedded. The same people that exploit people will exploit the environment, and vice versa. Social justice. We need to network. That's the key. And I'm going to come back to that notion of networking in a moment, because I want to come to the 10th point now, which I think is the most important. We need to do everything humanly possible to ensure that as soon as possible, 50% or more of all legislators are women. It's absolutely incredible that 50% of the human race is not considered worthy to be 50% of the decision-making of our human race. It is absolutely incredible to me. And if you look at the grassroots environmental movement, which I've had a good look at of the last 8.5 years, it's dominated by women. And why is that so? Well, first of all, of course, it's circumstances. Both the partners, the male and the female, are concerned about the issue. But after all, the male goes to work and the woman is left at home more often than not. Not always. Not always. It's changing. Yes, we do need 2 incomes now just to survive, we're told. But some of the most talented women have not been used by our society in the conventional way. And that means that they are now available to work 24 hours a day in many cases, to work on the threat to their children, their communities, and the planet. And they're doing it incredibly effectively. And there's another dynamic here, which I'm not certain about this. I'm still trying to work out in my own mind why exactly the people that are going to protect this planet are women. I have this gut feeling. I'm not trying to exclude men. After all, I am one myself. We have a role to play, but you're going to see that the leadership, the perseverance, the tenacity, the imagination is going to come from women. They terrorize politicians. They won't give up. They won't compromise if it's a threat to their children. They will not compromise. But it's been put to me that there's another reason, and that is that men have grown accustomed to work in hierarchies. We work in a vertical system. We go into professions and we get promoted. We climb up the ladder. And we're used to everything going in a vertical way. Whereas women, the ones that are left at home, if you look at their way of operating, they work horizontally. They go to those parties, maybe for the husband's work, etc., and they mingle with other women. They help the next door neighbor, that's horizontal. They meet other women in organizations, that's horizontal. And it's the horizontal networking which is precisely the thrust of the grassroots environmental movement. You reach out for help. You reach out to other communities in your state, in other states, in other countries. And it isn't to dominate. It isn't to control. It isn't to set up a structure where you have presidents and secretaries. It's to help you. And in turn, you will help them. And you share. And I think that's the model for the future of the planet. We've got to get away from these hierarchies where people are always in control, in massive structures which have to be supported with massive machinery, which can be tyrannical at times. We have to move to these small communities which don't control anybody else, but set up positive examples and network. And I'm sure that many of you actually are in some of those communities that say, essentially, we can't change the whole world. We don't have an awful lot of confidence in who gets elected for president, but what we can do is to put our own house in order, our own community in order, and we can show by an example that there is a less greedy society, there is a less violent society, there is a more sharing society, there is a society in which human beings can relate to one another, not just consuming objects, and maybe other people will copy our model. But meanwhile, we'll reach out. Well, sometimes in the trough of despair, you might not think that we will ever make this happen. But I want to share with you a wonderful quote from a German philosopher called Schopenhauer. He says, all truth goes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently attacked. And third, it is accepted as being self-evident. And I can't help thinking that people in the 21st century will look back on what we've talked about in waste management saying, well, that's obvious. That's obvious. Why did anybody do anything else? If you couldn't reuse it, couldn't recycle it, couldn't compost, of course you shouldn't have made it. No, of course not. Obvious. Who were these people who burnt everything? Strange people. And here's a lovely quote from Henry Miller. Oh, it goes back to this thing. I think, again, I can't stress this enough. When we're defining the sustainable society, don't let the technologists define the sustainable society for you. Because so many of these problems are technical, they will try to wrap a sustainable society around their inventions. And I think it's very important for us to say, no, wait a moment. This is what we want in a sustainable society, and these are the inventions that we need. You go out and make them. You fit into our plan. Or as a fellow said to me in Nova Scotia last weekend, he said, experts should be on tap, not on top. I love that. I love that. And so I want to say to you who have children who are interested in protecting the planet and the environment, don't assume that they've got to go to university and study environmental studies. In some respects, I think some of the environmental studies departments in this country are a disaster, as their professors toady to who's in power for their grants and so on. So they train them to be boring bureaucrats more often than not. So I say, if you want to protect the environment, you can protect it in many different ways. You can protect it with music. You can protect it with poetry. You can protect it with plays. That's what we need. Because we're dealing with attitude changes. And attitude changes can change with poems, and with music, and with plays, and with reorganizing communities and so on. That you don't have to be a scientist to save this planet. Listen to Henry Miller. Henry Miller said, "The earth is a paradise, the only one we will ever know. We will realize at the moment we open our eyes, we don't have to make it a paradise, it is one. We only have to make ourselves fit to inhabit it. You've only got to open that tent flap and look at those mountains in every direction to realize the wisdom that it's here. This is a paradise. We don't have to genetically engineer those mountains, those bison, those elks, the grass, the corn, or anything. It is a paradise. We have to do something about this." And this is a quote from a lovely man who's both a farmer and a poet, Wendell Berry. He says, "And the world cannot be discovered by a journey of miles, no matter how long, but only by a spiritual journey, a journey of 1 inch, very arduous and humbling and joyful, by which we arrive at the ground at our feet and learn to be at home." I just find that the most beautiful statement on the environment. Absolutely gorgeous. And finally, I have 3 messages. The first message to citizens is don't let the experts take your common sense away. They will if they can. You've got to hang on to your common sense, because common sense is another word for wisdom. It's experience. It's what you've learnt the hard way. It's what you've learnt through the stomach and through the pores and through the heart. And don't let them take that away from you at public meetings or public discussions. You hang on to that common sense, because often in that common sense is the right question that they have forgotten to ask. The second message is to political leaders. Put your faith back in people. Don't keep running to machines and consulting firms to solve every problem that comes along. Share it with the people. We want more of a partnership between the people that we elect into office and ourselves who elected them. Unfortunately, many of us find local politics excruciatingly boring, so we've only been too content to let these people get on with it. But we're finding that to our peril, that's a bad policy. We need to nurture that leadership and let them know that we don't want them to tackle the drains and the lampposts and the schools and the transport and the garbage all by themselves with consultants, that we will be prepared to help them. Put the faith back in us. And if politicians don't have confidence in the people that elect them, they should resign and let someone go in that does. And finally, I say this because I'm sure there are lots of activists out there. The most important message that I can give you is to have fun. We cannot afford to be as miserable and show that we're as miserable as some of the issues that we're confronting. And they are miserable. It's not a joyful knowledge to know that one species is going to be extinct every 20 minutes. That's a miserable fact. And the fact that children in New Zealand right now are having to have their sports activities in the morning instead of the afternoon because the ozone hole is already upon them. It's already there. We cannot afford to be as miserable as these issues, because if we're as miserable as these issues, no one's going to help us. And it's only by showing that we're enjoying this battle that we are going to win this battle. No one's going to join miserable people. They don't. They try to get away from it. I mean, I've had activists say to me, Dr. Connett, since I got involved with this, I don't go to parties anymore, I don't have time to watch television, I don't sleep with my husband, don't sleep with my wife, you know, really miserable. And then they say to the person next to them, will you help me? What? Become a wreck like you? No fear. You're not a model for happiness. So I have decided that my kitchen is never going to get painted. I decided, I mean, for a long time now, my kitchen needs painting. There are things I need to do to that kitchen. And I decided that I couldn't do what I was doing every weekend and paint that kitchen. And I used to think at the time that all this would be over and I would be able to paint that kitchen and go back to a normal life. I no longer am thinking about going back to a normal life. This is my life. This is my normal life. And I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying it. And I'm having a terrific amount of fun. I'm having a terrific amount of fun because the fun in this movement is, number one, I'm never bored. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I can get very upset, but I never get bored. I do not have time to get bored. It's one of the most incredible challenges. Someone's put this ball on your lap and said, save this, and you find it's the planet. And it's heavy. I know. And I say, if you can get your kids, or some of you are kids, if you get involved with this, what a thing to say to your kids. If you really get involved in this, you're never going to be bored. You won't need drugs. You won't need alcohol. Well, not too much. But where is the real fun? To me, the real fun is being given this incredible privilege, which we can all have the same privilege, except I've been more privileged than many, of going around the country and going around the planet and meeting people like you, meeting people that have no hidden agenda. You're not here to make money. You're not here to gain power. You're here probably because you're concerned about your children and their future. You're concerned about the country. You're concerned about the planet. That's the only agenda that's here. And that means I can get off the plane in any country, in any city, and within a few minutes, the person that's met me becomes a friend. Because we have so much in common. We've never met before. We have so much in common that this person's a friend. And it's become one of my friends, stretched out across the planet. So I am very excited about this human network out there that is fighting in this way. It's an incredibly inspiring network, and it will take a long time. It may not happen in our lifetime, but I don't think you have to be assured of the victory. No one has to tell you when the victory will happen. The only thing that you need to know is that you're moving in the right direction. That's the only thing that we need to do.
You've been watching Dr. Paul H. Connett talk about waste management as if the future mattered. Dr. Connett gave this presentation at Healing the Earth, a 10-day conference conducted by the renowned author and spiritual leader Elisabeth Clare Prophet. This program was presented as a public service by Summit University, Box 5000, Livingston, Montana, 59047, 5000. For more information, call 1-800-245-5445 or write this address. For a free book by Elisabeth Clare Prophet, or for more information about her teachings on the world's major religions, call 1-800-245-5445. That's 1-800-245-5445.